so much better, so much more sophisticated in so many ways, supposedly. How do we drop to and do that? Next slide. Okay, we're going to start now with my personal predictions that I'm going to use as a kind of a means to give you the ideology that I was talking about. You know, part of the game of science is predicting and then seeing if it comes true. Stick your neck out on the line. Go ahead, make some predictions and see what they say. See what comes of them. Here's my first one. The so-called prehumans are non-extincted Miocene apes. Apart from their bipedality, they share no basic characteristics with humans. None. That's what I say the prehumans are. They are not prehuman. They are post-Miocene ape. They're just Miocene apes living on like they've done for the previous 20 million years. No breaks in the action for them. And we just happen to find their fossils. Now, apart from the bipedality, that's a big point. The bipedality. Is it the same as ours? What is it? I mean, do they walk like us? No. Next slide. Let's talk about it. We know the Australos walked upright at 3.5 million years ago because we have a trackway from Laetoli in Tanzania. What happened was a volcano erupted, laid down a bed of ash, a pair of Australopithecines at whatever was alive at 3.5 million years ago. We assume it was Australopithecines. They were walking upright. We know Lucy walked upright. We add 2 and 2. This is what we get. But they left their tracks. Rained a little bit, sprinkled, set them. Another ash flow came in, and they're set for the next 3.5 million years until they're discovered in 1978. And we have it, next slide, we have it here, the trackway. Got it? Now, this is a close-up of one of the prints. Now, you'll hear a lot of different comments about this. There are some that say it's very, very human-like, and others say it isn't very human-like, but it's clearly at 3.5 million years ago, you got to have room to evolve. You've got to have room to develop. So you wouldn't expect a foot of an upright walking creature at 3.5 million years ago to be nearly as sophisticated as ours, because over 3.5 million years you're going to get a lot of changes. Okay, so, but that's it. Next slide. This is a human foot stepping off. Just, we all know how this works. Heel strike, roll through the arch around, come off and press off with the toes. We all know that. Next slide. Here's it graphically. Come down, heel strike, swing it around the arch, cut over into the ball of the foot, which is your thrust generator, out the big toe, and the others are balancers and thrusters slightly. Everybody got that? Next slide. This is a photogrammetric analysis of the Laetoli track with a human track. And this is just looking at the pressure points, the pressure ridges in it. Now, I'm sure you all can see what I see. It's pretty different. It's pretty different. It's very different, in fact. Very light heel strike relative to this. Very light strike up here, but the 2 equals about this right here. And then it toes off here on the ball and out the toes, but it toes off here sort of behind the toe, base of the toe, but right in that area. And the ankle is set up here as opposed to right here. It's a very different foot. It's a very different kind of locomotion. Next slide. Here we see it reworked so that we see where the ankle is, we see where the human ankle is, and we see the force areas. The push here, the heel strike here, the great reduction in it. You know how this thing's walking? It's laying its feet down almost flat. Flat. It's not boop. It's not thumping down the way we do. It's not locking its knee. It's not thrusting forward. It's not walking like us. It's walking a little more like the Groucho Marx thing, like shuffling along very quietly, very smoothly. Smooth down, smooth up. Smooth down, smooth up. And steady, very steady. Next slide. In fact, here we see it. Again, we have ours, which causes a kind of a rotation as we throw. If you look at very slow motion, time and motion studies of walking, we're bobbling. We're not steady. We're not smooth. And over time, this movement through our feet wears out our lower joints. We're not walking as well as we could or should walk. These guys are. This is a very smooth, very steady, very clean. You could just keep motoring on this and not wear out very much. It's very smooth, very different, and most importantly, folks, understand this, it's better than the way we walk. At 3.5 million years ago, the Australopithecines are walking better, efficiently, more efficiently, better biomechanically than we do today. Today. But I say they've had 20 million years to work on it. And so they got it right. By then, they had it right. That's what I say. Next slide. Again, these guys, might have been this one, could have been this one, or a different one, that left those tracks 3.5 million years ago. Next slide. Moving into these now, we know that the heads change pretty dramatically. But why would the feet change? Would the feet change if you've already just got it knocked, if you've got it wired at 3.5 million years ago, why are you going to change? Why are you going to do anything? Nature's not supposed to do that. It's supposed to get something right and stick with it. So I think these guys probably had the same kind of feet and were walking the same kind of way as the ones at Laetoli. Next slide. They needed some improvement in this head, and they got that. But I don't think they necessarily needed improvement in the feet. Next slide. Same thing again. I think it was a series of transformations that led to this rather than transitions. And as those transformations occurred, I don't necessarily believe it happened in the feet as we are told that it did. That we went from their feet to our feet. Their feet were better. Next slide. Second prediction. Again, sticking my neck out. You can come with me if you want. Stay back if you want. The so-called pre-human stride is nothing like a modern human. They are so far apart in foot morphology and locomotive style, no reasonable comparison can or should be made. My opinion based on my years of research in this field. Take it or leave it, basically. Next slide. Okay, now let's move into hominoids, what I call hominoids, and I do it a little different than you folks. I use that term to talk about the collective group of creatures in the world that are Bigfoot, Sasquatch, but others. You know the classic Patterson-Gimlin film. But there are, and these are, of course, the big ones. 8 to 10 feet tall, 800 to 1,000 pounds big. But you also have the abominable snowman Yeti type, more man-sized, 5 to 7 feet tall, 300 to 600 pounds or bigger. You have another kind, again, represented by the drawing of a Bigfoot, but still, let's just call it an Alma, because the Alma picture I've got didn't fit on the slide. It was kneeling down. But let's just call it man-sized and dominant in Russia. Again, 5 to 7 feet tall, 300 to 600 pounds in that range. And then we have the small one. Again, another drawing, but it just fit the slide. But let's just call this one the Agagwe-Sadapa kind, the dwarf kind, the 4 to 5 feet tall, 200, 250 poundish, the small one. And let's talk for a moment about the hobbit from Indonesia, because in all likelihood, that is one of these. It is just simply a Sadapa Agagwe type of hominoid. Because why? If any of you saw the 60 Minutes piece, you saw the poor guy sit there and say, yeah, there's nothing about it that's human except that it walked upright. So we have to call it human, because pre-human, because it was there only like 17,000, 18,000 years ago. You talk about stuck between a rock and a hard place, no pun intended. These guys really are. They have to call it human, even though there's not a human bone in it, and they know it. They are stuck. Next slide. Let's go back now and remember that we have all of these guys coming out of the Miocene. They're there. We know that Gigantopithecus came out fairly soon, about 5 to 8 million years ago. And we know that they range from China to India. Next slide. Here we go. some different Gigantopithecus jaws, and this is the big one, and that's the one that Grover Krantz took here, gorilla, human, next slide, and fashioned a head to go with it. Now, even though it doesn't have nearly the kind of canine that a gorilla has, Grover went ahead and put a gorilla top on it, but it could be somewhat modified from that, and it could look maybe a little more like this, not necessarily like that, but it was just Grover's interpretation. Grover was a classically trained anatomist and very much believed in evolution, and so he believed that it was one of these, and it could have been, but it could be otherwise. Keep that in mind. Next slide. This is Bill Munn's Gigantopithecus reconstruction based on the evidence of just the jaw. That's all we really have, but notice how much it looks like what we imagine a Bigfoot would look like. Next slide. Now, hominoids walked onto page 1 in 1951 when Eric Shipton, a very famous British mountaineer, took this series of photographs on the Menlong Glacier in the Himalayas, and it just took off. The abominable snowman was part of the culture. There's a good set of tracks. Next slide. This is a foot molded after those tracks, designed, and if you look at it, you think, man, that's ugly looking. Who could walk? Who could do anything? Bipedal or gorilla or anything, going to be tough. Not so, not so. If you're just living on mountains and always on steep ground, never on really flat ground or hardly on flat ground, that's a good foot to have because you're constantly working. You've got an edge. You can stand on like 2 inches and make it. It'd be like you ever see bighorn sheep and mountain goats and things, they can stand on like that. This is a good foot to have if that's where you live. And this seems to be the only place that they live. The abominable snowman yeti type doesn't seem to be found anywhere else except the Himalayas. But together, the Himalaya ranges comprise an area as large as the United States, so, they got plenty of room to roam. And very few people living there with them. And that's another thing. Next slide. We wonder, people say, well, how could all these hominoids be out there around the world, 4 types everywhere, where you have reports from every state, you have reports from every continent except Antarctica? How could they be there? Humans are everywhere. And what we are taught, and what scientists for the most part believe, except those who are involved in this research, is that the whole of it, the whole of the Earth, has been sort of sampled and looked at by at least somebody. And in reality, that's not true at all. Most recently, we found that if you take away the tundra and you take away the deserts, what's left is called, quote, arable land. That would be prairies, savannas, grassland, lightly wooded areas, heavily forested areas, jungles, swamps. And if you take it that way, half of it, we fundamentally don't inhabit. We fundamentally do not inhabit half of the arable land out there. They used to think it was 45-55 our favor, but really the most recent that I've seen is that it's not really that. Satellites indicate that it's still more like half and half. With all the cutting down that's going on, with all of that, still about half and half. There is plenty of room out there that's basically terra incognita. Basically terra incognita, just not well known, not hardly inhabited, hardly trekked. Fully 1/4 of the United States, this may surprise all of you, 1/4 of the United States has never once been foot surveyed. Never once. Because it's just too hard to get in there and do the work, even for surveyors, and that's a hardy crowd. The world is not what you think it is, and not laid out the way you think it is, not the way you're taught, not the way you're told. I mean, you live in a state right here, Washington State. How much of this state do you think has actually been foot surveyed? I'll bet you there's whole swaths of it that nobody's ever been into. It's just too hard. Next slide. The panda is a classic example of what I'm talking about. The panda story. The panda was the Bigfoot Sasquatch of the 1800s. Word kept coming out of China of a black and white bear that ate only bamboo. Vegetarian bear. Well, every so-called expert in the world that knew anything about bears said, well, you have white bears, you have black bears, you have brown bears, but you don't have two-tone bears, and they're all omnivores. They eat anything. They don't specialize in leaves of any kind. So, ipso facto, we can tell sitting right here on our desk that this is all wrong. Totally BS. The Chinese don't know what they're talking about. They're seeing things. And then in 1869, a French naturalist got one, brought it in, got it to Paris, and the world knew these things were real. And so every museum and major university in the world mounted a research team, put them into the field in Sichuan province, China, which is about the size of your state here. Sichuan province, China, about the size of your state. Very rugged mountainous terrain like you have here, covered in bamboo forests, just like your forests, but otherwise the same, bamboo forests. And they were just attacked by well-funded, well-equipped search teams to be the first to bring in that next panda. How long do you think it took? How long do you think it took? These are good woodsmen. These are people like Bob Gimlin. Lots of them back then.
1935, wasn't it?
60 years. 60 years. Now, you say, well, you've got to be exaggerating. Yeah, I am. They quit after about 30 and said, well, it was just a fluke. Has to be extinct now. And then 30 years later, Teddy Roosevelt's sons were over there doing some hunting, just hunting, you know, and shot one out of a tree. And they knew it was real. So then they crank up that machine again, but they had learned a lot by that point. And over the next 20 years, they brought in a half a dozen. And you want to do a good screenplay. I used to work in Hollywood. You want to do a good screenplay. Guess who got the first two? A woman. A woman named Ruth Harkness. Great story. All these macho men out there, you know, and she goes out and she nails it on her first try. And boy, there is so much sour grapes. And they say, oh, you got lucky. Oh, man, you got lucky, lucky, lucky. Next year, she does it again. Stuffs it up their nose. Man, I love stuff like that. Take this. Boy, I love that. Anyway, the panda. Now, what's the panda doing? What is the panda doing to be so wonderfully elusive for 60 years? Well, you see the deal. It lives in a green world, and it's colored black and white. Lives in the daytime. Easy to spot. It's out there, living in the daytime. Got to eat, got to move. Slow moving, not fast. You've seen them in a zoo. Stupid as a bag of hammers. I mean, just dumb. Can't even have sex and reproduce hardly in a zoo. We are not talking smart, intelligent, fast-moving, nighttime living creatures. We're talking nincompoops. Now, compare that to Sasquatch, Bigfoot, and any other hominoid. Compare that to monkeys, chimps, or gorillas. What was the problem? The problem was with us. It wasn't with them, it was with us. We think we're great in their environment. We suck in their environment. And that proved it. That proved it. And we're the same in the environment of any hominoid you care to name. We suck in their environment. We think we're great. We think we're masters of all we survey. As I just showed you, we don't even survey all we claim to be masters of. I hope you're getting a very different worldview out of this, because I've got a very different worldview than what I was taught. And I think you should too. Next slide. Okay, let's get back on hominoids. You all know this carving, you know Renee. Let's go over again. All hominoids, whether it's the big kind, Bigfoot, Sasquatch, whether it's the abominable snowman Yeti or Alma, whether it's the Agagwe Sidapa. They're all described essentially, fundamentally, the same way. Receding foreheads, big brow ridges, big round eyes, big wide pressed nose across the face, mouths that stick off, prognathous, no chin, necks cocked down, big thick muscles, big long arms hanging down to the knee area, big width between shoulder and elbow, thick muscles, covered in hair from head to toe. Now, take away the hair, and what did I just describe? Next slide. Those guys, the prehumans. The prehumans. The prehumans are hominoids. They look like them. They're like everybody describes them. And science will tell you, well, that doesn't count because it's anecdotal and it's just stories. It's case histories. You can, just like Tom was saying earlier, you can use that, and you should. Prehumans, hominoids. Human, different. Different. Next slide. Now, we just go through the quick proofs that we use. We all know these. I'm just going to buzz through them. The famous Patty. Next slide. The Minnesota Iceman. And we were talking last night. Lauren was talking earlier about the penises. And when I was a young man, I saw this. And I had absolutely perfect eyes, great eyes. My dad was an optometrist for like 40 years. And he said I had the third best pair of eyes he ever saw. I had some eyes. And I saw this in my prime in about 73, 74, somewhere. I'm not sure exactly because I didn't know I would be into this, but in that range. But when I saw it, I was already interested in this field. Got interested in it right out of college, so I was interested. And I paid my $1.50 or whatever it was, and I went through 3 times. And I saw it. And I'm convinced it was the real deal. I don't think it was a fake. You could see it laid in there. The water let the hair float up off the body. Long hair, about 3-4 inches long. Round. Each hair was round, fatter than a normal hair. You could really see this, almost like porcupine quills or something. And it had striping kind of on it, and every hole where it went in the body, every hole was perfectly circular. And you could see it, the knees were cranked up to the surface almost, so you could really see if you had good eyes. If you had bad eyes, if you just had a magnifying glass, you could see. Every hole was perfect. When you punch hair into a wax anything, you've got a tool. You go to Madame Tussauds Museum and you can see it's a little tool that'll punch the hair in, and when you pull it out, it leaves a little nick. Round hole, nick. Round hole, nick. You look at this, perfectly round holes. Real hair growing out of real stuff. But the bullet wounds, the hole in the chest, the hole through the wrist, the blown out left eye, the right eye, the sac of the right eyeball sticking out, you could see all this. And more than that, what you can't see in this drawing is that the wounds, all the wounds and the corners of the mouth were bleeding a plasma blood mix. It was pink. You know, you scrape your elbow and you get that plasma and the blood kind of mixing. That's kind of where it was when it got in there and when the water was put on, it was frozen. And those ribbons of blood and plasma went up from every wound, out of the nose, out of the mouth, out of the corners of the mouth, out of the 2 eye holes, out of here, and they went up to the surface of the ice and spread out and made circles about like that. About like that. And had little bubbles trailing up through them, little whatever that meant. Little bubbles. I believe this was real. I'm convinced this was real. Next slide. The Albert Ostman story, we were talking about that. Lauren was talking about it earlier. Next slide. This is the Alma picture I was telling you, representing Zana, the famous one from Tikhina in Russia that lived in the village for 40 years and produced the 8 offspring, 4 of which lived to maturity and whose grandchildren and great-grandchildren still live in Russia to this day. You talk about a documentary screaming to be made, crying out to be made. I've got a Russian friend in London named Andrew, and he has got connections in Russia, and he is a filmmaker, and he is just dying to do this. He can make it happen. But again, and I'm sure Lauren and anybody else here can tell you, to get the money for a documentary is hard just to begin with. To make one about something like this, it's so volatile. But it's unfortunate because it's a great story, crying out to be told. Next slide. This is the skull of her son, youngest son, Kvit, which I think looks significantly Neanderthalish, heavy brow ridge, sloping forehead, big nasal opening, but it does have a human, though heavy, a human jaw because it has a chin. Grover thought this was just a We got in a kind of an argument about it. Grover thought it was just a variation on the human theme. Well, tell you what, I'm glad I never played football against that variation on the human theme, because I think he could have ripped my head right off my body. It's just my personal feeling. Next slide. Okay, prediction number 3. Hominoids are planet Earth's only indigenous bipedal primates. They have lived for millions of years on every continent except Antarctica. For all I know, they might have lived on Antarctica at some time. But this is what I'm going to say for prediction number 3. Again, trying to form an ideology here that we all can get behind as the larger picture, the bigger picture. Next slide. Okay, let's talk about the proof of their existence in the tracks. Now let's go back to what's different about them versus us. Again, this is a standard Bigfoot track. It has a widened heel, an extended heel. It has an ankle centered up sort of in the middle area here. It has a shortened forefoot. It has all the toes about the same size, but in a different kind of arrangement that we have. They're like separated by a medium here all the way, indicating that their foot works fundamentally differently than ours does. Because ours would have this flattened out right through here. You'd have a heavy heel strike. You'd have the momentum through here into the ball of the foot and then out through the toe. What you have here is a line of momentum settling. You see there's no real deep heel strike. It's the same as this. You can almost see this part hit all the same, and the line of motion is straight up. It's balanced. It's centered. It's more stable. It's better than we walk. To this day, from the 3.5 million year ago print to this print, they're still walking better than we do. Walking smoother, walking more stable than we are. Next slide. A different one, different kind of foot, different kind of toes. These are the peas in a pod type. All toes the same size basically, but still that separated ridge indicating that the toes are working differently than ours. This one would be squashed through here. It's toeing off, not on the toes, but it's thrusting off rather on the forefoot. And again, the same thing, the extended heel, the widened heel, the ankle in the middle, the shortened forefoot, the widened forefoot, and the nice smooth tread through the soft down, soft up, soft down, soft up. Not soft when you weigh 600, 700, 800 pounds. That's not what I'm saying. Not light, soft. Soft. Boom, boom, boom. Hitting smoothly. Next slide. Now, this typical Bigfoot Sasquatch stride, and as you see, the gentleman, if we were out like faking it, clunk, clunk, like that to try to get the width, but yet, as you see, they're nice and smooth, and they continue on. Nobody's faking that. Nobody's carrying a barbell on their shoulders, getting the right depth and getting the right shape. Next slide. Bigfoot walks better than us. Again, I've said it a bunch, but again, here's why. Around here, this swinging of the torque around our arch and around here into the ball and out is just not as efficient, not as smooth, not as clean as that, in my opinion. I think it's just a better walk. Has been from the beginning. Next slide. Now, this is Grover's foot analysis, and he said that if you if you work on it, that you get a 31% increase versus 23% here. So it's this much of an increase, ankle forward. This is out of his book. Okay? Next slide. This is the ankle position of the Laetoli tracks. Again, just to remind you, ankle up, heel widened, it's very similar in its own way, very similar to the way a hominoid walks, to the way Bigfoot walks. Isn't it? Pretty easy to see. Next slide. This is Grover again, showing how thus the Sasquatch foot at a given stature has just a trace over twice the surface area of a human foot. Next slide. And we see this famous picture, I think, of Roger Patterson's foot with the Sasquatch from Bluff Creek. We see that comparison that we just saw. Next slide. Now we see a couple of other Sasquatch tracks, Bigfoot tracks, hominoid tracks. Now, anybody recognize these? They look a little different because they come from clay in a floor of a cave. But does anybody recognize where these come from? Where these hominoid tracks come from? Torriano, Italy. Right. And what are they? They are Neanderthal tracks. Neanderthal tracks. They are considered to be Neanderthal tracks because they were in a cave and they had Neanderthal artifacts around, and they are considered to be Neanderthal tracks. And yet, what do they look like? Smaller versions of this. In fact, they think maybe it was a male and a female, as were the tracks at Laetoli 3.5 million years ago. 30,000 years ago, 3.5 million years ago. Male and female again. And guess what else? Does this one look familiar? Next slide. Three and a half million years ago, 30,000 years ago. Australopithecine, Neanderthal. Pretty doggone close to the same. Is it not? Is it not? So, if we can make the case that Neanderthals were hominoids right up to us, then you can also make the assumption that right on through down, right on into the Miocene and right on out, hominoids. Upright walking bipedal apes. Up to, in my opinion, Neanderthal and through Neanderthal. Up to Cro-Magnon. Next slide. Turns out we have, of all things, complete Neanderthal feet. No other pre-human do we have the complete feet. We have complete because they buried a few of them toward the end. They may have picked up burial from Cro-Magnons, or Cro-Magnons might even have buried some of them. But somebody buried them and we have their feet. Here we go, human Neanderthal. Take a look. Look at the heel, the extension versus the human. The settling of forward of the ankle relative to that. And look, this is where you really see the difference. Look at the stability and the width of the forefoot, the shortening of it and the widening of it. And understand, you're looking at muscle going all the way around here. You're looking at a big, thick foot with a lot of muscle prepared to carry a very heavy body through a lifetime of hard use. Look at our skinny little foot by comparison. And look at the curve, look at the wobble. You can just see that sway that we have. Look how steady, how solid, how right up the chute this guy is. Better, 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 better is better, better than us. And balanced. Look at the difference, how dominant, how dependent we are on our big toe as opposed to balance. A different kind of foot. A different kind of locomotion. Very different. From the beginning.